Hi, I'm Josh Darnell with RESO. We're here today with John Breault at statewide MLS to talk about RESO certification.
Thanks for having me, Josh. Happy to be here and discuss this with you. As Josh said, I'm John Breault with statewide MLS in Rhode Island. I also have the pleasure of sitting on the RESO Board of Directors. And as you know, we've been talking about these certification reports for quite some time. And a lot of people have come up to me and asked for a little sort of how-to video on how to look at the reports, what it all means. And so Josh and I were talking and thought it would be a great idea just to record us going through my particular reports and just looking at the various elements and what it all means.
Thanks, John. Yeah, and just to explain the certification process a little bit, it's different now than it used to be. What happens now is that the providers, these are the MLS vendors most of the time, they'll test their systems until they feel that it's just right, where they can share the results with their customers, be John in this case or another MLS. At that point, the customer will receive a magic link by email, and they can go in and look through their results to make sure everything's how they want before they approve them. If they like everything they see, then they approve and all the results are published. Sometimes there's more work to do, however. We show a lot of industry averages and other data to help you know how your certification is going. So that's the opportunity at that point for the customer and the vendor to have a discussion and make improvements. John, maybe you'd like to take us through these reports.
Sure. And so, as Josh said, there's a link that we receive that I received when I did approve, and all the MLSs out there should receive the same link. That's the magic link, as Josh said, which gives us access to a little bit more information in terms of performance. If your vendors choose to publish that or not. If your vendors choose not to publish performance information, then that wouldn't be publicly available. The link I'm using now is the public link. So this link actually appears on our website. We make it available to all prospective data consumers, so they really get a good idea of how our data is laid out. And so here we are looking at our certification summary. A couple of things of note. This is the landing page. This is where we land first. And so of note, first, what I'd like to point out up top here is we actually have two vendors. Some MLSs do, many don't. But in this case, we use Bridge Interactive and then the CoreLogic Trestle system. And so the data obviously will change as I look at each of my two providers. Also, they sort of the data elements really fall into two buckets. There's the actual data, the configuration, I guess I will say. And then the other is, as I mentioned, the performance. Now, in these cases, we're not publishing that publicly, but internally, I do have access to that information and I can review it and see how each vendor is performing versus the industry average. So,
Yeah, and
uh,
on that note, with performance, RESO doesn't, we're not looking to really call anybody out here. What we're looking to do is give people information so they can make better decisions. And a lot of vendors, they're not aware of where their performance is at the moment. It could be better than the industry average. It could be worse. So what we really want to do is give people that information through RESO Analytics to let them know, are you ahead of the market? Do you have a little bit more work to do? And if the vendor, is happy with their performance, then at that point they can call attention to it by opting in and publishing it. It's opt out by default. The
so
customers, though, like John, will always see that so that they can helps them make better decisions about their providers.
yeah, and obviously, anything that stands out as a red flag. I mean, certainly as an MLS, I look at this, and if I see that, significantly below industry average, then I'm going to pick up the phone and call my vendor and say, hey, what's going on? Do I expect to be the fastest? That'd be great. I don't have an expectation that we necessarily will be, but I'm really looking for red flags here. And so with that, maybe we just talk, even though we don't have data in these, just to sort of explain the logic behind what we're looking at here, because you have an average payload size first, Josh, and it looks like the industry average is 0.38 megabytes. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's across all resources. And we usually pull 100 at a time. So if you select property from that resources drop down right below, you'll see statistics specific to property. So for 100 records in the industry average is 1.58 megabytes. That's what that means.
And let's just talk about resources too, for those that don't know. Maybe explain briefly what a resource is, Josh.
Great question. Yeah, so a resource is kind of a top level bucket in the data dictionary where the data lives. And so the easiest way to think about this is that like a member roster, for example. RESO has a member resource that corresponds to those records. We also have an office resource that shows all the office information. And generally, we classify things in certification to match what's in the dictionary. Sometimes we get some local resources there too.
Great. So in this case, so what we would see, I would see an average payload size for what Bridge Interactive is serving up, correct? And then a response time for that payload size, which then I guess it's sort of a mathematical formula here, right? Because then that equals this throughput. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, we extrapolate from the first two metrics. The throughput is in megabytes per second. So it's basically the first number divided by the second number.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so to really understand, so for example, I could see average response time like, wow, look at this, I'm way above the industry average, but my payload size is significantly smaller. And so while I'm getting, I guess, fast response time, I'm not really serving up a lot of data. Is that correct?
Yep, and that's exactly why we put all three metrics instead of just the two. Because if you only look at payload size or you only look at response time, it's pretty easy to make the wrong conclusion there. You might see a fast response time, but if the payload is small, fast response time doesn't mean as much as if it's large. So
Yeah.
by dividing those two quantities, turning it into more like a bandwidth, like an internet speed test, then it normalizes out those kind of elements.
So if
And
you're
so,
below average in one category, the idea, I guess, really is that this third one is the most significant to look at. Is that you want to make sure you're giving out uh, industry average throughput. Is that
yeah,
right?
and they're all
Ideally,
important. It kind of
yeah,
comes, the best rule of thumb for all of the certification stuff is exactly what you said earlier. You're really looking for the extremes with these kind of reports. So, if your throughput is good, that's one thing to look at. But you also want to see if your average response time is really high or really low. You also want to see if your payload's really, high or really low compared to the industry average, because even though that might get fixed in the throughput, say, your payload size here was zero 0.5 megabytes for property, and the industry average is 1.5 or greater, you might want to look at your property resource to see what kind of data you're giving out. You'd have a lot less data than most people in that case.
yeah,
So you really want to look at those extremes and see how far above and below you fall with respect to that industry average.
great. And so I guess that's a nice segue now to switching over to the other element here, which are the data elements and the actual data mappings, right? So now we see some different charts throw up, get thrown up, throw up. I don't know. Anyway, we see some, some different graphs here. First are the fields, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, those are all the fields in whatever particular resource we're looking at here. Again, we'll just stay consistent and stay in the property resource. And then the other are lookups, which are some call them enumerations.
Yeah. Yeah, RESO historically has called them lookups. We kind of kept that consistent, but lookups are enumerations. And
Yep.
those would be things you like in what RESO calls pick lists. That would be like a subdivision or a school district or, maybe a county. I just want to come back at a high level to what these charts are saying, though, before we dive into the
Yeah.
details. So we've got advertised and available. Well, what does that mean? And
Yeah.
then we've also got fields and lookups. So as John said, fields should be pretty understandable. Those are the fields that are going out in your data feeds. So if I'm a data consumer and I'm connecting to your API, then I should see list price, for example. So those are the fields. And advertised means that the server says they have it. It's in the server metadata, but that's different than if we actually find it in the data set. So, one of the important metrics here are really those blue bars that you see, the available. That means that we sampled a certain number of records from each server. usually up to 100,000 if we can pull it. And we try to calculate what we actually found in the payload. So the reason why we have this metric is that a lot of times there'll be a lot of fields advertised, but maybe we only see a couple of fields in the payload. And so that's something for the MLS vendor and the MLS themselves to take a look at if that's the case. If you see a really high gray bar and a really low blue bar, then that's potentially a sign of an issue.
Yeah, we're
maybe
telling
missing
people
data.
we have these fields available, but we really don't. In essence,
Yeah, and
right?
some vendors advertise everything. So you might see cases where there's always a high gray bar, but you really want to look at those extremes. Say that there's 600 fields advertised and you only have 2 available, that would be a problem, right? So it comes back to those extremes. And the other thing that's an issue, which you actually have here,
Mhm.
uh, we just talked about if the blue bar was much lower than the gray bar. We also have the case where the blue bar could be higher than the gray bar. That's actually kind of an issue with certification and compliance. It causes some usability issues. And what that means is that if a data consumer is pulling from that feed, they're going to see things show up that weren't advertised. And nobody wants that. They want to know what's coming. They don't want to just be surprised.
And so
So
why would
that's
that happen? Why would something not be advertised but be in a feed?
it's some cases it's just because we haven't made advertising things like lookups very easy through the past standards. We're working on that now to make it easier to advertise. Um, so people sometimes just put them in the payload without advertising it. We don't enforce that right now in certification, but we will in Data Dictionary 2.0. That will fail.
Now, and I wonder, I'm going to now start playing around with some of these things to see here. So on the bottom, we have the data elements also broken down by all of the elements, the RESO compliant elements versus the local or non-RESO compliant elements. And so I'm wondering if we click RESO, if the blue bar drops below, we're still above.
Still a
So
little above.
yeah,
But
because I'm
I
just wondering
wouldn't
if a lot
focus
of
on.
those ones are local that aren't, anyway, local obviously goes up.
No,
quite a
excellent
bit more,
question.
but
I mean, and
yeah.
these are the kind of questions you should be asking. Those of you out there who are doing these certification reports, it's exactly the kind of question you should be asking. And you should be asking, what fields are those? As well. We could talk about that in a little while.
Mhm.
To come back to these data elements, though. So what does that mean? Well, as John mentioned, all is everything we got from your server when we tried to test it, your vendor. And then RESO is only RESO fields and lookups. We have local as well, and there's a lot of interesting information about local. It's perfectly fine if you have local data. In fact, we want you to have local data because usually that's where the new standards come from. If people start doing things in a new way, usually comes from the local data. Um, but the dictionary is not complete, doesn't cover every use case, and we don't want people to feel that they have to only map to the dictionary. They're allowed to create their own new things as well, as long as it's not something that's already in the dictionary. It's just an important point to make here. And then IDX is the IDX payload. So RESO has fields that are tagged for inclusion in the IDX payload, and we've included that in the report as well.
And so one thing that's interesting that I like to look at here as well is, so if we look at the local fields and see how many we have, well, you have this thing over here on the right, the availability threshold. And so, well, because what's interesting right now, this is the total number of fields, but you can narrow them down, or I guess limit them based on how data availability. So in other words, 25% and above, that means at least 25% of them have a value in it. Is that correct?
That's correct. And these are going to impact fields more than lookups
Right.
because it's more common that a field would be there 25 or 50% of the time than a lookup. Lookups are there usually just in, small cases, say that
Yeah. Yeah,
standard
of course.
status is closed, for
Right.
example, or something like that.
That makes sense.
But it's still important because
Well, like right now, I've got 144 local fields, right? But as we go to like 50%, it narrows it down to 62, right? So I guess what I'm getting at is like, when I look at this and I sort of say, geez, do I have how many of my fields are mapped and how many aren't? When I start looking about the ones that aren't, and how used they are. If they're not, used a lot, maybe it doesn't feel like it's as big a problem to me, or maybe it's not something that's immediate, something for immediate action, but still something on my radar that I can just sort of look at a little bit later and deal with.
Yeah, and that's a really good thing to point out, by the way. So what should people be doing when they get the link to this report? Well, definitely look at performance and other things that we've discussed. But moving that slider, going back to that local and moving the slider up to 100%, those show you which local fields had data in them all the time. And there's 30 of them in this case over there.
And
on
that's
the
all
field.
resources. If I look at like property, for example, if I really want to focus on listings, 17, right?
Yeah, and so the question you might ask yourself, and there's no lookups in that case that are available in property 100% of the time. The question you might ask yourself in this case are, what 17 fields are those? Because that would be a good place to start in terms of trying to map the dictionary. You might ask yourself, well, are these mapped to the dictionary or not? Sometimes we don't catch everything. The average right now is 10. So, you have a little bit more.
Yeah.
But it's not like you have 100 and the industry average is 10.
Yeah.
You're still within reason.
Now, another interesting thing too to do here is because I have two providers, is look for consistency between my providers and say, okay, well, let's look at CoreLogic and see, oh, now that number is only 4, right?
Yep.
So why is it different between my providers? So that also gives me another action item to look at, a little bit of an inconsistency between my providers.
This is a great topic because it's a little harder to see on these charts, but RESO has tools coming, RESO alignment reports, which will help people understand the differences between the providers when they find things like this. It's a very important thing to think about, because what if data is going into one provider one way and then being sent to another provider through some back-end process, and not everything is being mapped the same way? Well, then you're going to have inconsistencies between your providers for your data feeds. So that becomes an issue at that point.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little harder to see from this because this chart is designed more for the high level and then the drill down.
So should we drill down here, maybe? Click on a view detail.
Yep.
All right.
You still can't compare from the view details. Now, this is individual reports. So if we wanted to go back to where we were a second ago, maybe select local there and move your slider up to 100%. Sorry. I meant on the details part. Go back to your detail report.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and what you can do here is select the same thing you had before, local, and then turn the slider up to 100%. So there's your 17 in property that you saw before.
This is nice because that number shows me in each resource what the number in each resource, right? So that
and they add up to 30.
I have the availability, right? Obviously, that number will change. Oh, there we go. Yep. So, and this actually
what are
shows
these kind of things?
The actual fields, correct? Yeah, here they are. Mm-hmm. These are the 17 fields?
Yep.
Yeah, that's cool.
So what you might do, you notice in this particular case, you see this RIAR underscore accuracy.
Right.
What you might do is just ignore the RIAR part and look in the dictionary for things like business or DOM. We know we have dictionary, DOM in the dictionary.
Right.
Days on market though instead.
So why is that? Why is this RIAR underscore DOM?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So those kind of things would be good candidates to think about trying to map the dictionary if you can. So for the MLS or the analyst at the MLS, they would look at this and make a list of all the things they found that could possibly be mapped to the dictionary, and then they'd contact their vendor and try to resolve those issues.
Great. Excellent. So all right, let's bounce back. And so the same thing. Now I've got two vendors, and I can go and look at the CoreLogic one and do the same thing. Local.
Yep.
Knock it up to 100%. Now this one only has 4. And these are presumably, they may be something that they themselves have. Days on
it looks like a special field for replication.
Yeah,
so they probably are valid local fields in this case. We don't have anything like that in the dictionary.
And actually, to that point, it's a question I actually asked you earlier today. Under resources, you may see some things as well. When I was looking at CoreLogic, for example, they have a number of resources that I didn't recognize. So this speaks, I guess, to your advertised versus available, or it's slightly different?
No, that's a great question. And go ahead and select one, and you'll see what comes up if you do select one of those. So in this case, you can see the gray bar is pretty high. You got 75 fields in there. We could go to that other screen and understand what those are if we wanted to. But for now, just stay here. What's happening is that when RESO tests providers, they can give us everything if they want. It's up to them. But what they only have to give us by requirement is stuff that's pertinent to the MLS operation. So providers might have extra data that they advertise that's available in other contexts that RESO doesn't see because we're only testing from this MLS role. So Realtor might be one of those for CoreLogic, and they might give it out in other feeds, or they might even use it internally. So what the 0 here is saying is that we saw it showed up on the server, but we didn't fetch any data from it.
Excellent. And like you said, I suppose we could go here and we could do that same thing. Well, no, those actually don't show.
This is a good question. So you actually have to move that slider one over to the left. We have a position to the left.
So this is explain that difference. Above 0, that means there's at least.
It means that we had data showed up at least once.
Once, right? Versus these are everything. Gotcha.
Yeah. So here is data. Here's all the things that data never showed up in. So there were 75. Go ahead. Yeah. Those are the 75 fields inside of that Realtor resource. And we never saw data in any of them. And this is across all resources. So if there were certain fields, if you scroll up, you'll see properties in there as well. We were able to pull certain things from property, right? But here's all the things we never found any data in property. These are things that were advertised on the server. They said they support bathrooms partial, for example. But when we pulled records from the server, we never found data in bathrooms partial. So then they're in that list instead.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so these are things you could chalk up to just, I can ignore these things, but there are things that may raise questions like, what am I seeing this thing and what does it all mean? And, do I need to worry, busy myself with this? And the answer is no, I don't.
Yeah, there's a very good reason why this happens. As far as implementations, some providers choose to advertise everything possible that they can support. In CoreLogic's case, they can support everything in the data dictionary. But when they go into a particular market, those markets don't use all those fields. They only use some subset of those. So they like to keep their metadata consistent across all their markets, which is one way to design things. There's no right or wrong. You can either show everybody everything or show each market only what they're supposed to see. And it's about 50-50 in terms of who makes those choices. What you have to worry about is if you don't see a field show up in the payload that's supposed to be in your data feed, like list price, for example. If that shows up in that list, I'm sure it's not. And you can search for it too if you want. But if list price were in there, then you'd have an issue. Yeah. So you have close price. We never saw that. If you expected close price to be going out in your data feeds, well, when RESO tested you, we never saw it. So that would be something to talk to your vendor about as well.
And then list price low, which I don't even know what that is, but that's interesting.
Go ahead and click on it. If you select that, then there's a link to the dictionary right there.
More info.
Or you can just click on the field name above, and it'll take you to the data dictionary. So if you're curious about what this is, then it'll take you to the wiki. Now, there's a piece of information that's also useful on the wiki. It's this usage stat. One question you might ask as an MLS or a vendor is, well, I don't have this field, but how common is it? Maybe I should have it. In this case, we've got 62% of systems, 10 out of 16, those are vendors in this case. They have this, and 10% of organizations. So organizations in this sense is mostly MLSs. So it's
49
actually not very,
out of 491 MLSs.
Yeah, not very common. 10%.
Yeah.
10%.
That's it's super great resource. I mean, it's great that it's awesome that you can link to it from the certification tool, but it's also, you can just go right to the wiki, from your browser. And it's a great way when you're researching fields or thinking about implementing a field, or maybe you have a field and you're wondering if it's time to get rid of a field. I mean, the analytics tool will let you see how populated that field is, but this is a great cross-reference to see also how many other orgs are using that field or not using it.
Yeah, it's been really valuable for RESO to use this to make data-driven decisions, and for an org, it is as well, because just because something has low usage doesn't mean that's bad. It could be an opportunity in some cases where your particular business, you see a need for it and you could provide value there. And you also see it's not very being used very often by others. So that kind of gives you a competitive edge, right? If you're providing value there. So uh, it's more information than a report card. We're not trying to grade people. 100% is not good or bad. Obviously, for something like list price or standard status, if you're talking about listings, you do want 100%. But it really just depends on the context.
I could search standard status here, right? Standard,
Mhm.
there it is right here. So, boom.
And when we found it, it was there 100% of the time. So this is another great case to try to understand what's going on with your system. Sometimes we see things that are 99% of the time or 98% of the time. John, if you hover over that availability badge toward the top, you'll actually see the count of records.
Availability
Uh,
right here.
yeah, see, so we sampled, when we tested you, we sampled
Uh,
4,477 records, and we found standard status in all of those records. But in some cases, what we found with these certification tools, we can tell MLSs and vendors things about their systems that they don't know themselves. For example, they think they have a business rule that ensures that standard status is there 100% of the time. That's not the case here, but sometimes we don't find it always 100%, and then they have to go figure out, what happened with those older records. Another case for that is APN. A lot of times people think there's an APN that's required all the time, and in testing we don't always find it. So this is a good way to help also audit your business rules. If you slide the slider up to 100%, remove that filter there. Go ahead and remove that standard status filter.
what's that?
You have to X out of that filter too.
I have to
Uh,
X out of that filter. Oh, I don't
yeah,
know.
where it says filter all. Uh, Go back to your left and then,
Oh, there it is. Okay. All
sorry.
right. Perfect. There we
Um,
go.
so these are all the things that are supposedly required in the system 100% of the time. For the most part, unless it's a computed field, this should match your listing input form. So in other words, if a user tries to edit a listing, they should always be asked to put city in.
Yeah. And so far, I'm seeing 100% across the board, right?
Yeah, and hopefully there's no surprises here. So
Yeah.
for an MLS, really the best place to start is dialing up to 100% first, making sure all of your required fields are present in the feed, and then maybe moving it down to 0%, exactly zero all the way to the left, and seeing which things might be missing.
Excellent. Well, I think we've covered a lot, right? We've given a lot for people to chew on. I mean, maybe briefly, I mean, these last two items here, web API server core. I don't really even look at these. So, but people will see them and will probably want to know what is this telling me? So what is this telling me, Josh?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for all MLSs, in order to be counted as certified, they must have both Web API Core and Data Dictionary. For other providers, they can kind of take them a la carte. But the reason why we require that for MLSs at RESO is that there's a lot of MLSs in the United States and also internationally. And if you had to come up with different queries for every single different one, that would be a real challenge for interoperability, right? Even if it's just 20 different queries for 20 different providers, that's still very challenging. So what the Web API Core standard does is it has about 40 queries that all servers are expected to pass. And at a high level, what that does for the industry is it makes it so you can write, a way to get your data from a feed in California and use that same code, same program to pull the feed in statewide. So this really, a lot of times for the MLS, they won't really need to look through this. Just the fact that it's there is the important thing.
Yeah.
And RESO won't issue a data dictionary endorsement without Web API Core present. So it's really just more for consistency for the users at the end of
Hmm.
the day.
Hmm. Great. Well,
There is one other thing
yeah.
I'd like to point out. There are help buttons. Maybe they're a little hard to see, but over toward the bottom left there of that chart, there's a little question
Oh,
mark.
there's this here. There's also one on the top right, I think, help over
Yeah,
here.
that's the general help that goes off
Oh,
to our
okay,
home
but this
system.
here, okay.
Yeah, and this will show you, this will explain a lot of the things that we've just gone through uh, on a per report basis. So we also have one of these on your detail report as well. So this will explain, and this is very similar between both reports, so the content
Mhm,
there is about the
mhm.
same. But you'll see these help buttons across the site. And we're going to add a tour component as well. Probably should have done that already, which will go through a lot of things that you and I have covered today.
Great,
Just one last thing before we wrap up here.
okay.
Um, if you actually go back to the report you were just at, then you'll notice when the page loads, by default, we have this resource summary selected. And then you can see some content over in that bottom right pane there. Now that doesn't change when you move the slider. That's static content. So we have some statistics about how this particular provider is doing compared to the industry average for RESO. So if we look at that fields there, we see that RESO is at 72% and the industry average is 50%. So what does that mean? It means that of all the fields that had data in them, 72% were RESO fields. And in this case, the industry average is 50%. So in general, all the fields that we find, usually 50% of those are mapped to the dictionary. So this feed is actually a little bit more mapped than the industry average. You have more standard fields, fewer local fields. Local's 28% here, and the industry average is 50. So that's good. If you can map the dictionary and put out a more standard feed, that's really the goal. And then for lookups are challenging for the industry at the moment because there's lots of different ways that these things are they show up in different markets, and even the dictionary has a little bit of standardization to do here still. So the most important thing for Data Dictionary 1.7, which is this current version, is to make sure that field percent is not too low. You definitely want it to be at least the industry average. It's kind of the same thing as a summary report, but you get to see the raw stats here. And you can click on some of the other resources. Property is a challenging one because there's so many fields. Yeah, if you go ahead and click on member, you'll see that member is up around 86% and 81% is the average. Same with office, etc. Those are much smaller resources,
Mhm.
and so they tend to have fewer local fields to begin with. Um, but property is a real challenge because there's so many fields already, and
Yeah.
then there's a lot that it doesn't include. So go ahead and click on property. I just want to show one more thing before we wrap up here. So that was the data availability stat. Go ahead and click on that payload statistics tab right next to data. So this kind of shows you details about how we sampled the data. This is kind of the stats for nerds part. As we mentioned before, this provider had opted out of publishing performance. So for the payload size there, you see 0 megabytes and response time is not applicable. But we can still see some industry averages there, and that's important. And in this case, you might wonder, how did we sample? Well, we sampled um, using the modification timestamp field, which is what most people use for replication. So that's why we use it. And we were able to fetch 17,400 records from the property resource. Those records had a date range from December 2021 to June 2022. So what RESO tries to do here, we go backwards, starting from most recent and then go backwards, and we try to get 100,000 records if possible per resource. So usually that'll result in something 6 months to a year of samples, and that's a pretty good sample. The higher that number is, though, the more accurate the statistics will be.
And and that's the same in terms of the analysis for data elements, not just performance. So in other words, you're getting the newer listings.
Mhm.
Uh, I guess the reason I ask is because if again getting sort of back to trying to figure out what fields are being used, and I see that I have a field that's consistently empty, I know that like in the last year or the last 6 months, uh, this field is not really being used an awful lot by my customers. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's correct. And the reason why we do it for more recently is we want, we don't need to go look back at things that might be 10 or 15 years old, because if any changes or improvements have been made, it
Right.
wouldn't be reflected there. But say you did make the change and something was 0 and then you've asked your vendor to do something, and now you're going to start seeing it, for example.
Yeah.
When we retest you, we'll see that reflected in the new stats. And then eventually, as time goes on, we keep this 100,000 records thing. The new change will completely outweigh the old one. The old one will just disappear, right? Because we don't go back that far anymore. So what this is supposed to do is show the improvements over time. And RESO will also be notifying customers and providing trends. For example, say you didn't have list price, which is bad if you're an MLS, but just let's say you didn't have list price, and then you added it. This last year's certification report, when you ran your test, you might not see it there, and then now when you run your test, you see it in your new records. And what we would do is show you, hey, here's the percent improvement or increase in adoption for all the fields that you've added since last year. Yeah, we're looking to make this a lot smarter. This is really just the first release. We launched this last Q2 at the RESO conference. And we're working on a number of ways to use all these analytics, like those DDWiki stats and other things that we've gathered in the time since, to make this even more insightful for you. So MLSs will start to get many reports in their email when they get the notification to tell them, hey, you don't have list price. 99% of the market has it. Maybe you should consider adding it, right? So we can make things a little bit more intelligent as time goes on.
Excellent. Well, I think, Josh, we've covered everything. Yes?
Yeah, thanks, John. I really appreciate you doing this. And we will be adding tours as well. But, if you have any questions about RESO certification or RESO analytics, you can reach out to certification@reso.org.
Thank you.